Thank you all very much for coming. It's lovely to see your faces here. And this great evening, we're going to see a wonderful film and hear two amazing people talk about the personal stories that affect us and move us forward as we look at laws and we look at how we relate to one another. My name's JT. I'm part of the group called Whites for Racial Equity. We are one of the two groups that are putting on this event. The other is Allies in MIIS, and Dr. Pushpa Iyer will be interviewing Fred Nail later, and she'll tell you more about MIIS Allies if you'd like. I want to ask you all, please turn off your cell phones so they don't go ringing or texting or buzzing during the movie or the talk, please. Today is being interpreted by the MIIS students interpreters, and it's done in Russian. If you would like to hear what this would sound like, we have headsets up there. You can get those and hear this program in Russian. And many, many thanks to the fine student interpreters who are volunteering with it. All right. So tonight, I want to tell you a couple things out in the lobby. We have Combined Destinies, which is a wonderful anthology that Angeles and Caroline Haskell put together looking at how racism affects white people. It has won the Indie Award Best Anthology, and this year the University of Nebraska put out a new press release on it, so it's really doing amazing work because, as you know, it's still very relevant. You can purchase that out there, and as you're doing that, I hope you'll pick up a card for Whites for Racial Equity. In a nutshell, our goal is to dismantle racism. So you can see we're pretty busy. And we're trying to do it in many, many ways, from book clubs to movie clubs to events like this, to workshops, and there'll be all sorts of information for you out there. We have a great website that has resources about everything happening in our area. And we also put out an e-blast, an email, at least once a week, that will tell you about all the things happening in the area. So if you're not yet on that and like to know about things like this, I hope you will sign up and get involved, because it will take all of us to tame this beast that we know as racism that moves through every institution this country has. So tonight we're going to see a great movie, and we'll also be talking to two wonderful people who have a similar story midway. So I think we'll get on with the movie now. Thank you.
Mrs. Fleming, the Virginia Supreme Court just ruled against you. How do you feel about what happened here today?
Well, I feel hopeful. I'm hopeful.
And where will you go now?
Well, I guess we go back to Washington.
Right, so, all right, good evening everybody. My name is Pushpa Iyer, and I'm a faculty member here at the Institute, and I also direct the Center for Conflict Studies. This evening here today is hosted by one of our initiatives through the center. It's called Allies at MIIS, and we're very glad to be co-hosting this with the Whites for Racial Equity. Thank you, JD, for the introduction and all of it. So, sorry we paused the film over here. You understand, we want to have an interesting conversation to just understand what is going on in the film at this point before we go further and see what the ending is. It's a happy ending, so we'll be okay. So you give that away. I had to give it away, then we can all relax, right? So that's okay. Yeah. So it's my great honor and pleasure to welcome Fred and Angeles here this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Briefly, Anne is a life member of the NAACP and a founding member of the Monterey chapter of the National Coalition Building Institute, also a board member of the Village Project in Seaside. In 2016, she was honored as Woman of the Year for the 29th Assembly District of California. And Anne is the co-author of Combining Destinies, the book that JT referred to and which is outside and available for sale. Fred is the founder of Breakthrough. Breakthrough is an education program for men where listening, feeling, and discussion have replaced suppression, self-medication, and violence. And we just saw it on your website that over 1,800 men have graduated from this program so far. Breakthrough was recently honored during the Seaside Gala. And Breakthrough was honored during the Seaside Gala in 2015. So at this point, just want to have a little chat with you about what we were seeing in the film. And wanted to ask you, when did you meet? How did you meet? How did you decide to get married? What factored into your decision? Based on what we saw in the film, there seems to have been a lot of divide in that time period. Also, it did seem a little bit like there were people who were working towards, making the society something more equitable. So just kind of asking, what could you describe to us what it looked like in that time period, and tell us a little bit about your own story?
We were in graduate school together at Antioch, and it was Antioch's first graduate program. There was an internship, teaching internship, in an inner city somewhere for all students. And Fred and I both had returned from 2 years overseas. He had been in Turkey teaching. I was in the Peace Corps in the Philippines, and when I came back, I began that graduate program, and I began with an internship in Baltimore, where my parents lived and where I grew up. At the end of that semester, I taught 8th grade history, so I had 6 classes. The school was probably 99.9% black. Fred came in and took over my classes the second semester, and we met in that interim. There was a major snowstorm in Baltimore, and Fred needed a place to stay. My mother, who's a social worker, had agreed with the director of the graduate program to find Fred a place to live near the school. And he came to our house first because of the snowstorm. We met then. That's where we met. And so that was in January, right? Toward the end of January of 1966. Wow. We'll tell some more. He was the only white teacher in this school. Okay, there was a tremendous amount of racial strife in the city at the time. Baltimore had major race riots the following year, and the teachers in the teachers' lounge, when I would go in during that first semester, were really angry with Harry Belafonte because he had just married a white woman. So that was kind of the stage that Fred moved into.
Looking back on it, I mean, there we were. We would not have met then had it not been for this blizzard which shut the whole city down and gave us a chance to meet and spend a little bit of time together. And at the time, Anne was dating someone else. And this turned out to be a gigantic gift, because I wasn't even going to think about getting romantically involved with somebody who was already dating someone else. I was dating women casually at the time, but I wasn't intensely involved with anyone. And I remember that being stuck in the blizzard pretty intently. I mean, there was something that happened between the two of us. As far as I was concerned, it certainly happened for me during a discussion outdoors in the blizzard. I can still see the moment. I was captured, captivated, whatever it was. And then off she went back to graduate school in Yellow Springs, Ohio, and I stayed there to teach. And it couldn't have been designed any better. We exchanged letters about my experience in the school, and so we talked about the kids, and we talked about the struggles, and talked about the need to have the Peace Corps come to the school to do justice to these children because of all the struggles that they were caught up with in the inner city. And this served as a kind of values clarification time for us. We became great friends through letter writing. And because there wasn't anything romantic going on, it was just all out there.
Excuse me, can I interrupt?
Yeah.
And there wasn't anything romantic going on for me because it was against the law. And it never occurred to me to be romantically interested in Fred. Because I had been really conditioned to be law-abiding. And so anything that was against the law, I didn't even go there in terms of any part of me. I was very attracted to him as another person, as a human being, as somebody who shared my values. We were both re-entering this country, and we were both kind of in shock about what we saw when we re-entered, and we had tremendous amount in common. Actually, we had much more in common than it looked like on the surface. And the places where we have struggled have been places where we are just alike. Not in terms of our differences, just times when we are stuck because we are just alike. So I think that was very important that we were able to develop a friendship before we allowed ourselves really to even consider beyond that.
And we, we're coming out of the 50s and into the 60s. This is 1965, so there's an awful lot going on with the Black Power movement in the Vietnam War, the build-up of the Vietnam War, all of which we're both very conscious of. But I came from a background in Maine. Grew up in an almost completely white community where the pressure was on me to be a fulfiller of a suburban fantasy for some white woman. That was kind of what the kind of pressure that was in the environment that I grew up in and the expectation. And I had, because of my experience overseas and because of other things, I was not oriented towards this. It wasn't, I didn't really fit into that kind of a picture of a future. And I think that's one of the things that Ann and I shared, was that neither one of us were caught up in a suburban fantasy as a way of life for ourselves. There were other things going on that were really, I think, more important to us.
So I have another question for you, and that is, were you following then? I mean, you've been married now for 50 years, right? So it was about
51.
51
in August.
Okay. So around the same time as the case was going on with the Lovings, so were you following the case at that time, and were
We
you
were certainly
thinking?
aware of it.
Yeah.
And there was a case in the Baltimore courts also of a white man, a Filipina, because it wasn't just African Americans who could not marry whites, it was people of color, anybody of color, really. So I followed that case, and we were certainly aware of the Lovings. But by the time the anti-miscegenation laws ended, that was in June, and I was 5 months pregnant. So we were also very much involved in our own lives and in all of that kind of drama that was happening for us. So I don't remember us celebrating when the case closed. I remember being amazed that they actually did it. I think when we married, I had no expectation at all of laws changing. I grew up in Jim Crow South. Things were the way they were, and I felt fortunate that Ohio was not a state where it was illegal for us to be, and concerned because we could not legally sleep together in my parents' home in Maryland. But yeah, I didn't expect.
Did you have any recollection of the time around when the case was going in the Supreme Court?
I remember having, that the fact that the case was on its way to the Supreme Court, I felt like that gave us a great sense of freedom. That we didn't have to carry the case to the Supreme Court or be the ones to initiate this kind of thing, because we would have been in a fix if they hadn't, already been going on. At least we would have felt compelled. But it was, I say this now, 51 years ago, we were young and it was romance and we were starting careers and we were going to have a child, and so all that was going on at the same time.
We were really, I think we were both really enormously grateful to the Lovings. They had tremendous courage, and really grateful to the ACLU. I continue to be really grateful to the ACLU.
What was the reaction from your family, from your friends, generally the public?
Well, Fred courted my parents and my grandmother while I was in Ohio, and he was eating Sunday dinner with them he was taking his car to them every Saturday with some boys from his class to wash his car. And then he would drive them to DC and show them museums and all of that.
And what could be better? I mean, in a situation like that, where there's so much charge and so much fear, for me to become involved with her family. I mean, I was there every weekend and consulting with her parents about what was going on, and getting used to the city and doing things with them. So I became part of that family before we got romantically involved. And looking back on it, it was like, what a great strategy. It was really quite perfect. Given the difficulties that
really
were there.
Because my family comes from Virginia. Okay, Africans that were kidnapped, that in my history landed in Virginia, stayed in Virginia. So that means that my parents grew up in Virginia. My father had tremendous trauma as a consequence of that, and he would never have been embraced Fred as a romantic connection with me, but he embraced him as another person who was teaching in the school, was a nice guy, and came to his house every Sunday for dinner.
Yes.
So that the family thing worked much better because of Fred's prior relationship with them. Yeah.
Fred, your family was not very welcoming in the idea of remarrying Anne, right?
No, but very. The people who were not welcoming were, at this time my father had passed, my father's brother and my grandfather, my father's grandfather, disowned me in a heartbeat. And I was the oldest male in that generation. This is a very, as British as they can be, kind of family in New England. And so I was the chosen grandchild in that generation by these people. Also, I was named after my grandfather's son who died in a hunting accident. So there was a big bond there. But it was, first of all, when I'd gone off to be a teacher in Turkey, that was not good business. You weren't going to get rich and meet a white woman who came from a rich family and combine the wealth and play the game. And that was where my grandfather came from. So that was pretty bad. Then, when I said that I was going to marry an African-American woman, you don't come to the house, I never want to see you again, you're completely disinherited. My uncle said, which I thought was kind of amusing given the last name, how dare you give a black baby our family name? I must say, given the way my family was, and the women in my family, my mother, my mother's grandmother, my other grandmother's best friend, the women were all fine. You know, they thought I was an adult at 26 and said, well, you know, you must know what you're doing. You're 26 years old. And they wanted to meet Anne, and they were very nice to her. So, but it was the white males who were promoting, you know, wealth and success and status.
With the exception of your brothers.
Who at that time were boys.
Yeah, but they were.
Yeah, my brothers were fine, my high school friends were fine. You know, some of them said, you sure you want to do this? You don't have to, you know. Just because you're involved in civil rights doesn't mean you have to marry Anne. They'd say that kind of stuff.
There were also African Americans who were very upset by our relationship. But the majority of my family, and I have a huge extended family, although I'm an only child, I have a huge extended, very close family, and they all, when most of them all came to the wedding, there were like 100 people at the wedding. The wedding was in Washington, D.C. We had reception in my parents' home, so that meant everybody had to drive to Washington, D.C., and we had graduate students come from as far away as New England, and Fred's mother drove down with the boys, and they had to drive to D.C. for the wedding and then drive back to Maryland for the reception, and, you know, people thought it was a funeral line coming from Maryland. I mean, it was all very bizarre in some ways. And I can't remember where I was starting. I started seeing all those cars. Yeah, but I had a great aunt who came to the wedding and didn't bring a gift and interrogated Fred. I mean, she just interrogated him. And when she left, and this was 1966, she left a $50 check, so that obviously he had passed the so 1966, $50 was a lot of money. I had one man that I sort of grew up with as an uncle, although he was not related to me by blood, who lived in Virginia, and when I went back for my grandmother's funeral and saw him, he turned his back on me. So I knew that that was the reason was the marriage. But by and large, we got a lot of support from my relatives and also from my friends and also from friends that we had in school who were white. So that was a very important piece of being able to make it, you know, this relationship.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Fred, you talked about being in Turkey, and then you've taught in inner city Baltimore to help reintegrate Vietnam vets in society. So a lot of different work that you've done with men in particular. And you said your interest in human rights began at age 13, right? I mean, you were really very young when you started thinking about joining the first group to desegregate previously all-white public high school for girls in Baltimore. And you're a Peace Corps volunteer in the Philippines, which give you a perspective outside of the country, like Fred, to see some of these issues play out the way it played out in the international scene. So given all the responses that you've had from your family, some very positive and some negative ones, you must have gone through a lot of racial stress in that period of time, and I was just very curious as to how you dealt with it, given your background. Both of you were very active on the scene. Did that help, or were there new challenges that you faced in that time period?
I think our relationship was a big help in dealing with stress. One of the things that when I was thinking about that earlier today, I realized that I grew up knowing lots about Black history because I had Black teachers in elementary school and in middle school, and of course that changed when I got to high school. But I also did a lot of reading. I always read. But the the African Americans who were published primarily during those years, the 40s and the early 50s, were male. So one of the things that I did that really helped with stress, I think, was to make a decision that I was going to read every novel and every memoir written by a Black woman that I could find. And so whenever I had time, that's what I did. And as a consequence of that, it was like bringing people into my life who had very hard lives and who did very well, you know. And so it felt supportive, and it felt supportive of me when I was living, married to Fred. I have lived predominantly with white people. And so it's been a way that I've stayed connected to the Black community even when we were in places where we didn't see them. Although we lived in Ohio, with more diversity than here. And when we lived in San Diego, we were in more diversity than here. Friendships, I don't know what else. Fun, walks, movies, kids, all that helps with stress. Yeah.
I think the main way that I dealt with the stress, I just think the pain of it, I was raised, like most white people in the 40s and 50s, in a segregated world with such a massive amount of arrogance and ignorance. It was profound. And so, I think right from the time that and thank God Turkey got rid of some of that, being in the discovering all the beauties of the Muslim world and the friendships and a place where family values really meant family. But I think what I realized was you can't just, even when I was teaching in Highland Park, you have to, when you fall in love and you become part of a community that is oppressed with an incredibly unjust ways, you have to become active. Part of loving Anne and having children with her meant that I have to be active to somehow to look at the reality of the brutality and do something.
It's very difficult. It's very difficult to, it actually is impossible to watch somebody you love have pain and not do something. And actually the book that Caroline and I did was, came out of several things, but probably the first major impetus for it was being conscious of Fred's pain about racism. The way that he is being affected, not oppressed in any kind of way, but how his heart hurts. And so you have to do something. You have to speak to that. And I'm just so conscious of how this evil it impacts people, every color of people, even. And certainly those who are virulently racist are being hugely impacted, and they don't realize it by racism. So I think that a lot of our activism and advocacy and so forth has been a way of alleviating distress with fear, because we don't internalize it, because we accidentally put it out there, open my mouth. So I really encourage people to do that.
And one of the great moments of questioning in the process of marrying into Anne's family and her wonderful extended family, all the people being very nice to me, and very loving was, when I realized that, they had these, these black-only celebrations where they were with their relatives and their people, and I would be the only white person there, and which was fine, except that I remember going through a period, partly because of my relationship with her father, but also just the community in general, of saying, oh my God, I have deprived them of this place where they don't have to deal with white people. And even though, that it all worked out over the years, and it took her father many years, for us to work through all that stuff.
He got there, though.
He did get there.
Fred is his son. Fred's the best father he ever watched be a father, all of that. It took him a very long time because of his history.
Thank you for sharing your life with us, telling us the very deeply personal stories. I know it's still very deep, right? Exactly the world we live in today can only make it all come back afresh in terms of what you may have gone through. And I would love to chat with you a little bit more after the film and ask you some more questions of what to do in the world today. Yes, thank you. Hi, we're going to open it up for Q&A. So if you have a question for Fred and Anne, who kindly agreed to answer our questions, you can come up here to the podium. I'll use this mic, I'll leave it up here at the podium to ask a question. Chance to ask.
I have a question.
Yes, please. If you could come up here.
No. So I want to know how that segue went from you guys being friends to being romantic.
That's not fair, that was my question.
Yeah, who made the first move?
We want the romance.
Yeah.
It was a very fast romance. We met in January. We had a first date in April because I was in Ohio and he was in Maryland. He proposed 3 times in June, and we got married in August.
It was even faster than she said.
How did you decide that it was, or how did you acknowledge that it was gotten into a romantic thing? That's the
She
part.
came home for Easter break or something like that, and we went to the park with her family, and I knew that I was in love. I bought her some earrings, but we didn't talk about it at all. Then comes June. This is such a great story. Then comes June, and her parents do what parents do, and father's mother was living with them and said they were going to New Orleans for a week, and will you look after Anne and her mother and the grandmother? Well, we're away. Sure. Sunday night we had our first date. We went to a jazz club in Washington, D.C. She wore a red dress with ruffles. By Friday I had asked her 3 times to marry me. Twice she said no. But before the parents came home, we had made an agreement to be engaged.
Wow.
And we were married on August 27th. So, all the wise advice but we had been through this period of clarification and letter writing and getting to know each other. So there was
I still don't know exactly what happened. I got this incredible feeling that I need to be with this person. I'm supposed to be with this person. This is what I'm supposed to be with. And the only thing that, there was this wall kind of against letting myself feel how much I loved him because it was against the law. And once I got that in my head, that this is what's stopping it, then the next thought was, that's an absurd law. And you don't live your life based on a governmental decision. And once that came to me, then I was able to feel all this love for him. And then I needed to have somebody that I knew in my family would be supportive of me. Because I had no idea how my family would respond. And I knew I could not go through life losing all of them. So I went to my mother's sister, who had always been, was like a surrogate mother for me. My mother had a career. Her sister lived next door and stayed at home, worked at home. And so I went to her every day after school. I was very, very close to her. And I went to her and said, I think I'm in love with Fred. And he wants to marry me. And she said, if you love him, it doesn't matter if he's purple. And I thought, well, that makes sense. So the third time I said yes.
It was the third?
It was the third time. So that's how it happened. And we went off to graduate school, to another section of the graduate school, which was living together in a farmhouse in Vermont, in Putney, Vermont, with all the students in this new graduate program and all the faculty. So we lived in this huge farmhouse, and I said, we will be together all summer. If at the end of the summer we still feel this way, then we will tell people, don't tell anybody until then. And he said, okay. And then he promptly told his mother, the other graduate students, who all said that they had been with us at different times, and all of them had agreed, except for one African-American, the only African-American man in the group. All the other students were white, and they had agreed that any two people should be together was the two of us. So that was the way it worked. And they all came to the wedding. Yeah. Yes.
So first, thank you so much for being brave enough to exist as the people that you are. I appreciate your transparency here tonight. I appreciate you sharing your story. Pretext to this question, I'm biracial. My dad is black, my mom is white. So were your children ever impacted by your relationship? And if so, in what ways? Was it positive, was it negative? How did you deal with that?
Oh, I'm sure they've been impacted totally by our relationship. Children are by their parents' relationship. I think they've been impacted in wonderful ways by our relationship. Our son is definitely in the forefront of justice causes in various jobs that he's had. And our daughter is also very socially conscious, although she's an artist and has different ways of expressing herself than he does. And they're very loving, they're very intelligent, they're very warm, wonderful human beings. So I think they've gotten some of that from us. They were negatively impacted by living with people, by living in the midst of people who thought she was exotic and told her that, and that causes pain because that puts you on the outside. If people think it's a compliment, it's not really. I mean, it doesn't feel really like a compliment. It feels like you're different from the rest of us. And he was certainly negatively impacted by the reality of us not being able to be married in the state that I grew up in and in the church that my family had gone to for generations and all of that. so impacted that he arranged this June when we were celebrating Loving Day, 50th anniversary of Loving Day, for us to be married again, you know, in that church. He did everything. I mean, he even got the minister to stay away from his vacation so they wouldn't have to get a substitute to marry us. You know, so, you know. So, in that way, I think he was hurt, you know. Do you see other things there? Anything that you can tell her? Excuse me, I want to say this to you, though. People who say that kids will have troubles, kids have troubles. Okay? I mean, every child, I have never met a child with 2 white parents or 2 black parents who didn't have some troubles in the world. I mean, life is about having difficulties and learning how to deal with them and learning the lessons that they teach you and benefiting from the challenges. And it doesn't matter what racial identification you have, you're going to have some of that. Because it's part of growing up and part of life. So that's the way I feel about it.
Yeah, I think that, you know, getting an education about the breadth and depth of racism is very painful. And so there was a lot of that for both of our, I think it had a big impact. Our daughter tended to turn more inward, our son tended to turn kind of more outward, and she also had, you know, the exotic female, she had the female thing as opposed to his male. And there were some, there was definitely some moments that were very painful about the just confronting the reality of it for them both. And fortunately, a lot of the time they brought that to us. And I remember one time, you know, when all I could say to my daughter was, well, we knew that there are lots of good and loving people in the world, and you're going to have to find them. You know, and build your community with those people.
And she has done.
Yeah.
And we did. Okay, we built a community and are continuing to build a community of really loving people. And we brought them into their lives very, very young. So there are things that you can do that are helpful. And there are also issues that come up because we are living in a society where racism is in the air and in the soil. Kids are gonna run it. So you need support. And I'm sure you found that. You're biracial, right? Is what I'm saying, we're saying makes sense?
Yeah, Can you comment on how much progress we have made as a society since the 60s, since your marriage?
The percentage of so-called interracial marriages when we got married was very, very, very low. And it seems to me, if you just keep watching, the numbers just keep going up. So I think there doesn't seem to be, you know, any stopping love in that way. And that's I think, I think that's encouraging, for sure.
Yeah, just that, you know, there are very few people, I think. I mean, there are lots of people that have friends who are in an interracial marriage, or they have a relative that's in an interracial marriage, or they have a relative who's adopted a child of a different racial identification or something now in a way that was not true then. I mean, we lived in Ohio for a couple of years, and we moved to San Diego, and with our year-old daughter, or wasn't quite a year old, and heads would turn in Denny's, you know, go to Denny's for lunch or something, and everybody would stop eating and stare at us, okay, in San Diego. So that doesn't happen. we don't stop, people don't stop eating when they see us now. But it's also true that the rug has been pulled off of all kinds of muck, and it's coming up, and we're right in the middle of it now with this administration.
Did you at any point decide that this is not going to work out and that you wanted to end it?
Did we at any point decide that this wasn't going to work out and we wanted to end it?
A marriage?
Yes. I mean, even before, because of the pressures that you went through and all the hardships.
No. And if we had ended our marriage, it would have been because of us, not because of outside people. You know, no. I mean, we are surrounded by wonderful people. And we have been part of that. I mean, it's not that we stood still and they all came to us, but we are surrounded by wonderful people, and we get lots of support because of that. And that's been gradual. We've grown.
There were moments when I've wondered whether we would make it or not. Partly because of that pressure, but it's sort of the, you know, when you marry someone, there are many people in the room. I mean, we like the romance of the two of us. But my parents are in the room. Her parents are in the room. They're in the bedroom. White supremacy is in the house. The effects of racism. It's all in the house. So there are times when the stress of all that has certainly made me wonder. But the end result of 50 years of all of this for me is just an incredible amount of gratitude for the liberation of my own humanity. I was raised to be a white supremacist. I had all that junk in my head. And it was very well done post-war USA in white segregated communities. We've all seen Mad Men, all the stuff with addictions, and if it's difficult, you don't talk about it. So the looking for love, looking for the kind of love that has no pain is a fool's errand. You won't find love. You may find a little, you know, you may play a little game, but I'm very grateful for reality is much better than fantasy. And I was raised in a fantasy world and didn't know it, that excluded the reality of other people. So,
That's all right, please
no.
finish.
No, so did that make, did I say enough? Did that make sense?
Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you.
As I told you, I run this group here, Allies at MIIS, and I often find myself totally exhausted. I think I talked to you, Anne, about this. What advice do you have for those of us who are working on ending racial discrimination? It's not easy, and there's a lot of stress, and there's exhaustion, just pure exhaustion. Do you have any words of advice?
Well, I think you can't do this journey by yourself. So that's the first advice I would give anybody. I don't know what I'm doing with this.
Just put it right in your mouth. Put it right in your mouth.
No, it's just not on.
Raise it up.
Get it up. Yeah. Anyway, I think that that's the first thing. You have to find people who support you and people who share similar values and similar ideas. And you have to, I mean, I think that's first. And then you have to listen, I believe, to people who don't. so that you understand where they're coming from, and so you get some kind of compassion for them if you can't reach for empathy. That's a big piece of it. And not having your life be totally absorbed with news or with serious subjects or whatever. I mean, I think massage helps. I'm committed to that. So those things I think are helpful.
Yeah, I completely understand what you're talking about, holding a space for this to all unravel, you know, and being the one who's expected to hold a space takes an incredible amount of energy. And it's wonderful, wonderful work, so you don't run away. But the self-care part of it is extraordinarily important. What I needed times over the years, I finally learned that I need time to just go and be in the non-human world and be quiet and listen to the deeper parts of myself and find my center and learn more lessons about what it meant to love. But I had to do that. I had to stop the noise and stop and lay down the effort. And did I say be very careful who you spend your free time with? You know, make sure that they're really nurturing people and not more.
Also physical exercise. We danced a lot for many, many years. And that's really helpful in terms of alleviating stress, and I still dance. So I think, you know, movement of some sort is really important.
Yeah, we meant it. I don't know what happened how our kids survived. Because there was a time during the whole disco era where we were out 2 nights a week dancing. And I can't remember who was looking after the kids. Oh, somebody must have been. No.
Wonderful. I'm sure there are more questions, but in interest of respecting everybody's time, we are going to close officially now. Officially and unofficially, please feel free to come forward and talk to Fred and Ann. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here.